Hello. Welcome, everyone, to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Tessers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy. Best tagline in the business. With us today is Cecil and Sarah over there, who will be a disembodied voice.
Hello.
Collectively, we all work with a practice we call effective artistry that does therapy and executive functioning coaching, group therapy, group coaching, professional development for teachers and corporate events and blah, blah, blah. Focused on neurodiversity, focused on executive functioning. But what we're doing here today, this is our weekly 1 hour stream that's just basically open office hours, open conversation. We set a theme every week. The theme for this week is communication. But for those of you who are here live, we want you to chat, ask questions, comment, participate. I like having conversations a lot more than I like giving presentations. Answering questions is a lot more fun. And for those of you who are here live, that your questions, your comments can be anything about anything. Doesn't have to stay on the theme. We just pick a theme to make it easier to get started and have questions and people be able to determine, does it seem relevant? Am I missing anything, Cecil?
Apparently we're all wearing gray sweaters today. So.
Oh, well, there you go. Is Sarah wearing a gray sweater too with her video off?
Yes, because
Nope.
No, she's not going to turn. You could.
I was not. I mean, I feel very left out. I was not informed.
All of us. It's two of us, but yeah. So here we go. Let's talk about communication. I'll start by just saying a few things to kind of set the groundwork, like we always talk about, that we want to develop language together because language allows us to communicate more complex things in less time. So it's worth taking time up front to make sure that we're speaking the same language. So first of all, communication. No, let's start with a different thing. We've talked a lot on this podcast. This stream. I don't remember if we've done the specifics as like specific themes on this, but we've talked a lot about intellect and what the brain does, how the brain acquires and filters through information and utilizes information and all that. So something that's important at the root of all that is that what is real, and when we say real, this is why it's important to define this term, because these words can cause problems if we think we're saying things different. This is all communication stuff, right? We're defining real as things that exist outside of the self, right? That if I left this room, theoretically, the things that are in this room would continue to be in this room, even though I'm not aware of them, right? So that's what's real. And it's important to know that reality does not transcend time. I feel like I'm being real woo-woo. That's why I want to define these terms, meaning that reality only exists in the present moment, that a memory, no matter how accurately that memory is tied to real things, right, came from and is of real things that exist outside of itself, the memory itself is not real. It takes place in the head. And we know that memories are unreliable in various ways. Same thing with projections into the future, whether we're talking about in terms of fears and anxieties or in terms of hopes and dreams, or, I like to focus on more kind of empirical and scientific terms about predictions, right, guesses about the future. Again, may end up being very accurate, aligning closely with reality, but until that moment comes, is not real. It exists only in the head. And the brain, as we've talked about, attention and working memory are finite resources. So a real thing is endlessly complex, infinitely complex. There's way more data involved in any given thing than the brain can understand. So intelligence is a process of compressing that data, of filtering out what things are important and what things are not, right? That applies in language, communication, language. And whenever we talk about language, we are not talking only about audible language, verbal words. We're not talking only about words even, that we're talking about symbolic representation, abstraction, that pictures, pictograms, signs in sign language, that all of these things are language. Language is, I am doing something, whether that's creating a sound that sounds like a word or making a picture that is connected to something else. It's a symbolic representation of something else. So when I say right now, the word fire, each person who hears that word, who speaks English and knows the word fire, is going to have something appear in their head. And most likely it will be something related to what I am intending when I say fire. You know, a burning flame. I don't even know how to describe it without using the word fire, but it will be different for each person. We won't all be thinking exactly the same thing. So communication exists in a kind of unique role where it's a combination of reality, because we are actually saying words, we are actually making signs or drawing pictures or seeing pictures or signs or hearing words, you know, sensory data that exists in the world, but connected with that intellect, meaning an abstraction of a thing, not the full reality. So I always think of, I'm going to embarrass myself because I don't know a lot about art. This is not a pipe. Is that Magritte? Cecil, Sarah, do either of you know?
It depends on how you're using it.
Anyway, do you know, Sarah?
Nope.
Where's Aaron? We need Aaron.
Like
anyway,
pipe,
what's that?
Like a plumber's pipe, like a drainage pipe.
No, it's a famous piece of art. Maybe one of you can look it up and
yeah, we have the internet.
It's in French though. I think pipe.
Oh yeah, sound this one out.
Maybe I should not use a something I don't know enough about. But anyway, I think of that because people always talk about, you know, the title of that piece of art is part of the art, that it is a realistic drawing of a smoking pipe. And the title is This Is Not a Pipe, which is, you know, kind of trippy and meta and whatever. And people are like, oh, right, because it's not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. But the truth is, it's not even a picture of a pipe.
Oh, okay.
It is color. It is light rays reflecting off each little spot into your eyes. But then our perception, our intellect, takes that data and interprets it as pipe. So when you walk away, you can't remember exactly what it looks like. You know, even if you had perfect dexterity and knowledge of how to create, the right colors, you couldn't replicate it just from having seen it. But you could draw a picture of a pipe, and you could probably get about the shape and about the color or whatever, because that's what you remember, that compressed version of it, not the reality of every single piece of data that's coming in. So communication is this unique space that allows us to utilize our intellect to use these compressed terms so that we can communicate, think of big, complex things that we can fit into our brains because we've compressed them and removed a lot of the complexity of them, but also still engage with reality, right? The sensory data of talking. Even if we're talking to ourselves, just the sound of our own words and the feeling of the vibrations in our jaw and facial structure, etc. It is Magritte, okay? I feel good about that.
Yeah, so that's there for reference for anybody.
So that's all important to understand, because here is what communication is. Communication takes place in 4 parts. First, there's what I am thinking. What is my intention to communicate? So any communication is an attempt to affect what another person is thinking, feeling, or doing, right? I am trying to add data to you in this compressed way we call communication or language. Remember that it's not all just words. I'm using language to affect how you think, feel, or behave, what you're doing, thinking, or feeling. And so there's my intention of in what way exactly am I trying to impact that? So that's step 1. Step 2 then is everything that I do in order to communicate that intention to you. The words that I say, the signs that I make, the nonverbal language that I use, the context that I'm referencing, everything that I'm doing to attempt to communicate to you, to create in your head the same thing that's in my head. That's step 2. Step 3 is, of that, what do you notice? Because remember that we don't notice everything. The brain selects what is worth coming in through attention into working memory and what is not. So you will notice some of it, but not all of it, or theoretically some of it. Maybe you notice none of it, but you won't notice all of it. And you also may notice other things that I did not deliberately put in as part of my communication, but you think is part of my communication. So what I'm doing to communicate the intention is different than what you're observing as my communication. That's step 3. And then step 4 is how you interpret that data. So even if theoretically you heard every nuance of every word and every nonverbal whatever, you still would have different reference material in your brain when I say a thing, so you would interpret it slightly differently. So it's important to know there is no such thing as 100% fidelity in communication. It is impossible for two people to be thinking and feeling and doing and the exact same thing. The goal of communication is to get close enough that it doesn't cause us a problem, that it enables us to do whatever it is we're trying to do. And that's all context dependent. It depends on the specifics of what we're trying to do. If I say to you, hey, will you grab some food on the way home for me, right? I might be thinking of a specific thing. You'll do something relevant to that theoretically, right? And you'll bring food home. But then I might get mad because it's not the food I was thinking of. Because I thought when I said bring food home, of course you would know that it's Tuesday. On a Tuesday, we always eat tacos. Why didn't you grab the tacos I was thinking of? And of course, we can refine language and be more precise. And that's a big focus of what we've been doing, what we've been talking about. This is all like fairly heady and abstract stuff. Somebody give me some kind of, I'm worrying that I'm come across like some guru of like, yes, the mind connects to the world through the body kind of thing, which is true. But
okay, so we talk a lot about like building language and like having those same things, but like, how do you start that process? I know that sounds like a general question that has no purpose, but like for me, like I struggle with a lot of communication for many of reasons, but like when I first meet someone, I'm always like, what's too much? What's too little? How can I be clear? And then also I'm like, am I being too clear? Then I start to apologize, and it's this whole loop, and it's just like awkward. And then I spend the rest of my life staying up late at night thinking about that one interaction, and like,
Yeah, well, we talked about anxiety, we talked about rejection sensitivity, dysphoria, and a lot of what you're talking about can be categorized as those things. And yeah, it depends on the specifics. It depends on so much of the context, and I can never know what you know in that moment. Even if I'm the person you're talking about, if you and me are in a moment together, I can't know perfectly what you're experiencing and what you're working against. But you're talking about how do we start the process of communicating?
Yeah.
Are you talking about in general, like how do humans learn to communicate? Or are you talking about like, because we can talk about that, that's relevant. Or are you talking about in terms of like, there's a specific thing I'm trying to communicate. How do I get better at communicating that thing?
I mean, honestly, both. Like, let's start with the general human understanding of language and communication, because then that can prompt a little bit more specific questions, but there's also...
Okay. So generally, remember that reality and comprehensibility, I need a better word for that, understandability, intelligence, intellect, abstract thinking, they exist at opposite ends of a spectrum. The more comprehensible you make a thing, you're doing that by removing more of the complex details, filtering out what's important and what's not. If I say table, we all are thinking of a different thing, but I can make a reasonable guess that for the most part, we're either thinking of a physical thing that has a flat surface to set stuff on, or some kind of chart with rows and columns or something like that,
okay,
that conveys data. If I need to be more specific, I will say the things I just said. No, I'm talking about like a dinner table or an end table or a data, table, whatever. So we have to eliminate data in order to make it comprehensible, communicatable, holdable in our brains. So the process of developing communication as a whole is, we got to look at babies, right? That's where it starts. And it starts, depending on how you define different things, it starts when the baby's still in the womb. But regardless of the specific developmental steps and milestones, because there's variables there about when certain people do certain thing and yada yada, the process is one of filtration. And I think that's relevant to know that what we know, for example, in spoken language, is that babies start by making every sound that humans are capable of making, even though each language only utilizes a subset of those sounds. So there are sounds that human mouths and tongues and throats can make that are used in Mandarin, but are not used in American English. And this is where accents come from, right? It's because the sounds are different in different languages, different regions, whatever. So even if we learn it, we have by that time probably lost the ability to make that sound faithfully. So it's a process of filtration. Babies start by making all those sounds, and the ones that get responses, they start to do more. And we talk about finite resources. If I do one thing, that means I'm not doing another thing. So the things that don't get responses get done less and less until they're completely eliminated, right? Not completely. We all like stub our toe and make sounds that we don't normally make in communication necessarily. So that's important to know, because people think of language development, communication as a process of acquisition. I'm learning a new word. And of course we do learn a new word, but we do that first through trial and error, because part of what's relevant to your question, Cecil, is that we use language to develop more language. It's what we are doing right now. I'm using words that I am fairly confident that we can all understand in order to build up into a more complex term, more specific, more precise term that we might have disagreed about, had a wider gap in earlier, but now that I've used these terms where I think we have more in common. But then again, you'll notice that I constantly stop and say, does that make sense? I do that for a lot of reasons, but primarily it's because I need to know if what I'm trying to communicate is the same thing that you are interpreting. It will never be exactly the same, but I need to know if it's close enough for me to be ready to move on to the next piece. Because if it's not, and I move on and I'm using a word that to me means this and to you means this slightly different version, then that's going to cause problems potentially.
Okay.
So we use language to develop more language. I was saying all that stuff at the beginning because before you have language, you have to do it through that process of trial and error. You know, if you think of any like ridiculous slapstick comedy, you know, of somebody being rude and trying to speak to someone in another language, and that sooner, you know, like they'll eventually just be like ooga booga, and then somebody responds and like, oh, that means something. Okay, good, you know. Or like people who think that a word, like in Arrested Development, that Anyang, they think Anyang is his name, because we're basing it off of other things besides the language,
such as like institutionalized white supremacy and racism. But yeah,
well, I said it's problematic, and but just saying, it illustrates the point of what people default back to when we don't have a common language to build on, is we got to like gesture to things in reality. We have to, that's the whole point of language, is that if I need you to think of a fire or fire, I can now say the word fire, but if we didn't have language, I'd have to like build a fire to show you. So language allows us to abstract that data and symbolically, you know, create thoughts, create images in each other's heads. That's why I can do all those tricks that we always do of like, you know, the one I've done on this a million times of until I say what I'm about to say 5 seconds from now, you're not aware of the feeling of the chair underneath you. But there's lots of things we can do like this. I can say, may the force be, and most people, because I'm trying to pick something that's, you know, fairly commonly known, most people I can reliably say in their head immediately said with you to finish off that phrase. Or for example, if I were to say 774, this is going to be relevant to Americans, probably not so much people outside of America. If I say 724-386-91, there's a sense of inconclusiveness that comes because the tone that I used implied that I was giving you a phone number, but I didn't give you enough digits to make a phone number. So our brain was expecting a certain thing and it's different. That's very hypnotic stuff, by the way. So maybe something we'll talk about someday. So to develop language is a process of using language to develop language. That's why we do what we're doing here. And that's why in a relationship, the more time you have with each other, the more experience you share, the more you automatically build a language together, even if you don't put specific effort into it, because you can reference things like, remember that time, right? But we can also consciously do it as well. This is a lot of what we do in therapy and in coaching and in couples counseling. It's just making sure that people are, you know, that a word that one person is using to mean this thing and the other person is interpreting as this other thing, we identify that difference and then facilitate a discussion around it so that we can come together. Not resolve any arguments, but enable people to talk about what they think they're talking about.
I mean, that just opened up a whole can of worms for so many questions that I have. I mean, if anybody else has questions, please feel free to jump
if anybody does. But until someone puts some in, Cecil, give me your questions.
Well, I mean, that like brings up the idea of, oh, there we go. Where did that go?
Oh,
so how do I say no to people who ask for my help without hurting their feelings? I'm extremely perceptive, and it makes me feel like crap to know someone's feelings could be hurt because of me.
Okay.
That was poorly read.
This is a very good question, and I promise I will give the answer that the person is looking for. But before we get to that, there are other pieces of language that we have, or at least what I think the person is looking for, but we have to talk about other pieces of language in here. So, because the premise here is that if I say no to someone, it will hurt their feelings. Hurt their feelings is a turn of phrase, right? All of this is language. So what exactly do we mean by hurt their feelings? What do we mean when I say I'm extremely perceptive, feel like crap, know their feelings could be hurt, et cetera, right? So the process that's happening here is somehow the person asking this question, we're going to call them Bob, I don't know. Somehow Bob got the impression that Alice, isn't that like the typical, like Bob and Alice is like what they use in all the textbooks? I feel like that's a very good Bob and Alice. Bob somehow has the impression, the perception that Alice would like Bob's help. And so Bob now is trying to figure out how to communicate to Alice that Bob does not want to or is not capable of giving the help that Bob believes Alice is asking for. Remember, all of this is perception, not reality. So this can go wrong in a million different ways. Perceptive is a particularly interesting term, right? Because we're talking about perception here. Perception means interpretation. Sensitivity means I'm aware of the data. Perception then is how I'm interpreting that data, right? I'm perceptive. So the implication there is that if somebody's feelings are hurt, I am going to know about it. And that if I am perceiving that I have hurt someone's feelings, that is accurate, that their feelings are actually hurt. And there might be some problems in there. And then, of course, the question is changed here at the end to say, oh, it's not that I'm hurting their feelings, it's to know that their feelings could be hurt. So here's one answer to this question, but I don't think it's the answer that the person is looking for. One answer to this question makes me feel like crap to know someone's feelings could be hurt. We're back to our anxiety conversation from last week and the week before. There's an outcome I don't want. I don't want their feelings to be hurt for whatever reason, because I care about them and it's an altruistic thing, because I'm worried that they will then treat me differently in ways I don't want, whatever. I don't want their feelings to be hurt, and I'm not confident that that's the case. So it is important to me, to whatever extent it is, that their feelings not be hurt, and my level, the likelihood, my level of confidence that their feelings are not hurt, there's a gap there, and that gap is what's creating this makes me feel like crap. We could call it anxiety. We can call it social anxiety. We can call it all kinds of things. So one way to answer this question would be to say, okay, then you need to develop a process to be able to determine whether or not this person's feelings are actually hurt. Whether that's developing ground rules and building a relationship in such a way that you can ask them, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that, but I'm really nervous about saying no because I'm worried that that's going to hurt your feelings. Can we talk about the fact that I can't help you with that? Can I explain to you that, because if I'm worried that I'm hurting your feelings, it's likely because I think that you will interpret my saying no as you're not important to me. I don't care about you. So can I be very clear to you that you're important to me and I care about you and I would like to help you and this is all for some important to me, but I still can't? Or maybe even why. And of course, sometimes that's very appropriate. Sometimes that's a wild violation of my boundaries. I don't owe you an explanation of why I'm saying no, right? It depends on the specifics of the context. So this is the question I think the person is asking.
And if not, feel free to correct us. But
yeah, please. The question I think the person is asking is, I feel like there's a way to communicate a no to someone's request for help that will predictably or reliably or likely result in their feelings not being hurt. And I don't know what that is. Can you tell me what this magic turn of phrase is to say no to someone knowing that their feelings won't be hurt? And my best answer to that, given the limited context, is the one I just gave, is that you got to look at why is it that you think you're saying no would hurt their feelings? And my best guess generically is that it's because you believe that they will interpret your no as back to cost and value. I'm saying no. I'm worried that they will interpret that as it's not valuable enough to me to do because they're not understanding the cost of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That you're asking me to do something that you think would only take 10 minutes of my time and a little bit of my energy, and you believe that our relationship is such that that's a reasonable request and I should say yes. And then I say no. So now you think, well, I'm not even important enough to you that you're willing to spend 10 minutes of your time and a little bit of your energy to help me with something that's important to me. But what if really what you're asking me, even though you think it will take 10 minutes, because maybe it would take you 10 minutes or whatever, would actually take me 2 days. And then if you knew that, you would be totally fine with like, oh God, I wouldn't even have asked if I realized it was going to take you 2 days, right? So we can communicate about that cost side of things, but the simplest, quickest, most generic way to say it is to say, I'm sorry, I can't. You know, I care about you, I value you, I want to be helpful, but I can't do that specific thing. Is there something that I can do? Or even better, here are some things that I could do that I think might be helpful, but maybe not, you tell me. And of course, the default way that people do this, the one that happens all the time already, is just explaining why you have to say no. No, I'm sorry, I'm busy, right? But then it gets into that thing of, well, everybody knows that, and that's a default one, so people use that as a lie to say, oh no, I'm sorry, it's not because I don't value you, it's because I'm busy. But since that's so common now, I think, oh, well, people are going to think I'm lying, even though I actually am busy. Or they said they're busy, but I think they're lying. And all of this is this communication piece where what we're communicating is different than what we're intending to communicate. And it's important to know, by the way, there's no fault here. Fault is a pretty useless concept when it comes to human relationships or human existence at all. That the only thing that fault really does, the only thing it's really useful for, is to say, there's a thing that's really bothering me. It's different than I want it to be, but I am labeling it as somebody else's fault, and therefore I can stop thinking about it because I don't have to think about what I might do, be able to do, have to do to make it different. It doesn't enable me to change it. It might change. The other person that you're labeling it as their fault, they might change, and especially if I say it's their fault in the right way, maybe they'll change it and it will get resolved, but that still requires me to communicate. But otherwise, it's just a way for me to be able to say, there's a thing that's happening that I don't like, and I'm not going to do anything about it because it's not my fault. And that's useful. I'm not downplaying that. It is very useful sometimes to be able to say, you know what, that's not my thing. I wish it was different, but I'm not going to pay attention to it or worry about it. We talked some about this last time. Other than that, it doesn't really have any utility because it's not true. Because whatever I'm trying to communicate to you, if what you interpret is different than what I intend, well, theoretically, another person might have interpreted it the way that I intended it. And theoretically, another person could have communicated what I intended to communicate to you in a way that you interpreted it, so, you know, with fidelity. So it's neither one's fault. It's just whatever happened in this process, there was some difference.
Okay. So it's interesting that like just your answer to this seemed to be building upon a number of our previous like stream. Like you talk about anxiety is like, you know, having the confidence to be able to say this is because it's you practice that, you understand the reality, you've, you know, built this like almost understanding and trust and that nice little balance there in order to communicate that with someone. But even before that, you understand like your abilities. When we talk about you know, scheduling your energy opposed to your time, you know, it's understanding that and requires of it. And so it's interesting that like this communication piece seems to be like, oh yeah, so now that you got all those core things down or underlining structural things, now you could start to build communication on top of that. Is that an accurate way of looking at it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, that's like a softball. It's like, oh, let me just set you up to say like, oh, how great these ideas are. But
no, the point of communication, the point of language is to be able to communicate things with more efficiency. It takes an hour for me and you to communicate back and forth to make sure that we're coming to a place where we use the term resource or anxiety to mean the same thing or close enough to the same thing that it doesn't cause us a problem, that we can accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. But then once we put that hour in, now for the rest of our relationship, I can now reference anxiety without having to explain what I mean, and with us having a closer understanding of what each other means. So if you were to go back and watch all these VODs like in a row, right, binge it all, you would see as time goes on, I'm spending less and less time in each one giving caveats, for example, about, oh, when I say this, what I mean is, because I'm becoming more and more confident that people have a better understanding of what I'm saying because we've spent time establishing that. And if anybody's watching this who hasn't watched previous episodes, they might be feeling a little more lost, or they might, I might have said something that really angers them or feels invalidating because it's being interpreted differently than I intend, or because I'm unaware of how I might be interpreted, that I'm trying to be clear about something, but don't have enough reference or viewpoint to know that somebody might interpret it in such and such way. There's a large part of what we're talking about when we talk about privilege, just generally, by the way, is, I have not had to put effort into understanding the fact that when I say, like, take, a slur, right? That if someone uses a slur, that it can have an impact on people, a negative impact, hurt people, scare people, anger people, whatever, a bad impact. But if I'm not the kind of person who's been impacted that way by the slur, I have no experience in my life to tell me that. So I have no understanding of the fact that somebody might feel that way in response to that slur until and unless somehow communication is used to teach me that. Because I will never have that response natively, right? Theoretically, to that slur. I need somebody else who has that response, that experience, to explain it to me. And now I can make an adjustment to what I'm doing, because now I can understand, oh, I see why it's a problem to say that word. But until that happens, I have not had to spend any of my time and energy worrying about that word. And this is a large part of where, like, when people say or do things that other people find offensive, and then they say, well, I'm not racist. Why are you calling me a racist? Like, that's ridiculous. That's not what I meant, right? I'm not saying it's a good reaction, but it's an understandable common reaction to, they really didn't mean that in a lot of those cases. That's a different kind of racism, structural, systemic racism of, like, why have you had the opportunity to not know that whatever you said or did was problematic? But still, that doesn't reflect on the individual.
It's not that they don't. Okay, there's not. It's their responsibility still to understand and adjust and learn from that. So we're not saying that, like,
I don't disagree with what you're saying,
but just one caveat there, because, like, this is more for, like, kids developing into this and being completely
ignorant
I
don't disagree with what you're saying. But responsibility is one of those words. What do we mean? Like fault. What do we mean? So yes, I think it is bad for a person to say anything that hurts another person, whether or not the person who did it or said it knows that it would be harmful. The harm is still bad. And I wish that the person would know why, the fact that whatever they were about to do or say would be harmful, so don't do it. Yeah. And a lot of people do and say things that they know will be harmful, and that's a whole different thing. But sometimes people don't. And that doesn't mean that it's okay for them to do or say those things. But we approach it differently as far as fixing it, right? Like, you see a lot of discourse around, like, oh, if we call people racist and whatever, make them unsafe in these spaces, then they'll just go to places where they can be racist without anybody calling them racist and become more radicalized and whatever. And again, none of this means that any of it's okay or not okay. It just means dealing with reality versus interpretation changes what you attempt to do to make things more the way you want them to be. Cool. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Cool. This is like the third time we've at this stream that I always wanted to refer to ContraPoints. She has some interesting things to say about this. You guys should look her up. She's got a very interesting person. ContraPoints. She's on Twitter and she has a YouTube channel. So,
let's take another question. Oh, go ahead.
Brings up another question about, like, it's kind of like lines of, like, how do you say no to people is. So you talk about, like, language, using that fire example, and, like, building it can sometimes be difficult, and even attempting to build it can be difficult. Like a good example is like with my parents. Sometimes it's hard sometimes I feel like we don't have a language, and I have to, when I talk with them, it's about me translating everything and into a language they can understand. And I don't know how to like move beyond that. And is it too much for me to expect them? Like, if this is way off, like, let me know. But
no, it's not way off. So expect goes back to that same thing about responsibility and fault. Is it reasonable?
Okay, so it is their fault, you're saying. I like
that
this,
they would change. Meaning, to what extent should I put effort into making this communication work versus should I not put effort into making it work and rely on them to put in effort to make it work, right? And again, that can't, it depends on the specifics. It depends on how important it is to you to communicate that thing to that person. But I can say that the process here's one exercise you can do. And this, an exercise you can do. This is not about what's really happening. This is not something that everybody should do in all cases, in all places. It doesn't change anything about what's bad and harmful and what's good by whatever things that you determine that. But here's an exercise you can do, is when somebody responds differently than you thought they might, especially the more surprising it is to you, when you say something to someone and their response is so off of what you expected that it's shocking, assume, this is the exercise, not truth, the exercise, assume that they are not responding to what you were trying to say. That the reason that you're shocked at their response is because that would be a weird response to what you were intending to communicate, but that they're responding to something different, something where their response would make sense. And then the question is how to figure that out. And there's a lot of different ways, but you know me, I'm all about that authentic communication and literally just saying like, oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I just asked you like a very like small, reasonable thing, not a big, and then you reacted as though it was a big thing. And I'm not saying that it's not, I just didn't think of it that way. So can we clarify? Because maybe what I was intending to ask sounded like something much bigger, or maybe I'm mistaken about the fact that what I thought was small really is a lot bigger than I realized. But can we get more into the details of what just happened there? As opposed to, whoa, fuck you. Oh, we're streaming, not supposed to swear. Communication. As opposed to like, what the heck? Like, you're being so unreasonable. You're being ridiculous. I asked you a tiny little thing and you're acting like I'm asking the world of you. And again, not because that might not be accurate, but because it's generally not going to be very useful, depending on whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. If what you're trying to accomplish is communication.
Okay.
If you're just trying to get out of there, that's a different thing, and it might be very useful for that. But if you're wanting an ongoing relationship, if you want to be able to communicate with this person again, then the best work is to always get more clear. So when they respond differently than you think, it's because there's something you missed. And maybe it is that they heard what you intended them to hear, but there's stuff you didn't realize about why they would react that way, as opposed to how you thought they would react. Or maybe it's because they interpreted what you were intending or what you communicated differently than what you intended it to be. And that's why it's strange.
Okay.
We have a kind of like rule. My mentor, Andy Mahoney, was big on this rule of when you're stuck, go back to assessment. That if you've tried something that you thought would work, that you thought would get you closer to what you wanted, and it doesn't work, back up and gain more information. You're missing something, as opposed to, press forward, try it harder, or try a different thing to supplement that thing or whatever. Oh, look, someone's offering for us to become famous by buying followers.
What? That's what I've wanted every day of my life.
No, clearly. Does that kind of answer your question, Cecil? If you give me specifics, specific language or a specific argument or whatever that you want to resolve, then we can get more into the specifics of what to do there. But you don't have to. I mean, this is a live stream. I don't know how specific you want to be about talking to your parents.
I mean, I love my parents, but like it could be difficult, and like that's, and so I mean, even saying that too much to them is difficult. So I like the idea.
Go ahead.
oh, we're too used to each other. Like, oh, go ahead. Like with the parents, sometimes it's hard to like in those moments, especially is like, how do I like assess, like step back and go, okay, that didn't work out that way. How do I do that in a way that's not condescending or whatever? Because like, I mean, I'm not always aware of how I come across, and sometimes I can come across.
Well, and I'll tell you a lot of that, what we could call social anxiety, you kind of referenced it before, and that question kind of referenced it. A lot of what we can call that is about that lowered predictability, the lack of, some of it is about, I'm more sensitive to rejection, so it's more important to me to get the response I'm looking for, or at least avoid the one that I don't want. But some of it is about less confidence about that I'll be interpreted the way that I want to be interpreted. And again, remember, that's disconnected from reality. So one thing that's important to know, especially for neurodivergent people, is that the more facility you have with language, the more you rely on thinking, which neurodivergent people have a tendency to do more than the norm, the more you rely on intellect, abstraction, to solve problems, to understand things, as opposed to just doing something and seeing. There's upsides and there's downsides to everything, right? And the upside of that is that I am aware of more possibilities. And therefore, if I can really delve in and have the time and energy to sort through those possibilities and the knowledge and the tools and support I need to be able to select from among those possibilities the one that is most likely to get me what I want, the upside there is that I'm more likely to get what I want than if I was only aware of one possibility. The likelihood that that one possibility would be the best possibility is less than that the best of 10 would be the best, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
In other words, so like if I said, all right, Cecil, I'm buying you dinner tonight. Do you want a salad? Do you want a burger, or do you want pizza?
Salad, like, why is that the default? None of those.
Well, you're having a neurodivergent experience right now. Answer the question. Which one do you want?
Well, out of those three choices, salad, I guess.
Yeah, okay. And obviously, it's a very easy to interpret response that like you don't like any of those choices, but at least salad is one that you can stomach, that you can survive.
I mean, I'll eat all three, but like salad just
right. But of those three, it was the most palatable, even though it's not something you actually wanted or will enjoy necessarily. Yeah. But then if I said to you, all right, Cecil, you can have a burger or pizza or a salad or Thai or Mexican or Japanese or pho or, sushi, another type of, whatever. If I list 10 different things, then the likelihood that one of those options will be something you want more than one of the original three, there's a better chance. It still might be that one of the original three was the one you would prefer, but the more options I give you, the more likely that one of those is going to be a better fit. But the downside of that is it takes time and energy and attention and working memory to sift through all those possibilities. And this matters in communication. It matters in language, because if I know that the word love can really mean a million different shades of things depending on the context, then when you say the word love to me, if we haven't been very clear about what we mean by that, I can't interpret that. I can't unpack that in my head until I've heard you say enough more things to clarify the context of how specifically you meant love. Or I might interpret it one way, but then as you say more things, I'm like, oh, he meant love this way, not the way I was thinking, and I have to retroactively go back. And so it turns into a language processing issue, that I'm actually capable of understanding language on a very deep and complex level, but I need a lot more time because I am sorting through a lot more possibilities. And when you put that on the front end of I'm about to write an email or a text to somebody, and I'm aware that my language could be interpreted in a billion different ways, I need more time and more energy to sort through all those possible interpretations to make sure I'm getting the one that's going to, have the best chance of getting what I want out of it. And it will. You spend the 45 minutes, it's going to be a better chance of getting the response you want to get. But is it worth the 45 minutes? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Okay. So there's upsides and downsides. So a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about social anxiety is I know that no matter what I'm intending to communicate, somebody might interpret it differently, and specifically that they might interpret it differently in such a way that they think of me poorly, or they think of me differently than I want them to think of me. They think I'm being rude. They think I'm being dismissive. They think I hate them. They think I'm weird. They think, and so I'm sorting through all these possibilities. And as we speak, extemporaneously, I'm sorting through a million different possibilities of what you might mean. I'm playing the conversation out 7 steps ahead, which means finite resources, right? Some of that is dedicated to the 7 steps ahead. And therefore, I missed something that you're saying right now, reality versus prediction, intelligence, right? Everything has a cost. Everything has a value.
I mean, so it seems like we always go back to the same things. Like, I know that we're beating a dead horse here. And again, that idea of cost and value, and which is goes back even more to our core of like really understanding yourself. I feel like I want to say this every time when there's streams. It's like we always talk about these steps, and it always comes back down to like, taking it back a step and like, okay, what is it you want? What is it you are going for? Like, what are your steps? What are your limits? What are your things? And that's just another example of how like, oh, this is a chance to almost to get to know yourself. Is that an accurate way of looking at it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the way that I put that to make it, I think, easier to kind of comprehend and carry forward is, and I think I've said this 3-step process, right? You got to know what you want, then make a plan, then execute. And of course, those are all recursive and they play with each other. But in large part, and I don't want to get distracted and go down this path necessarily with the rest of our time, but a lot of people's struggles come from the fact that we don't approach it that way, that children are taught to execute first, because that's about reality, do a thing, interact with the environment, and then taught to plan later, middle school, high school, talking about American culture, generally speaking, we start to teach kids how to like think ahead and make plans. And planning, I think did we talk about planning on this thing? I don't know.
A little bit, yeah.
But planning increases the likelihood that you get the outcome that you're intending to get, but at the cost of spending those resources making the plan, and that you have to do steps that you may not otherwise want to do because you're guessing that it will lead to where you want to go, blah, blah, blah. And we very rarely get to the point where we teach people how to figure out what they want other than negative goals. Because negative goals, meaning a goal to have an absence or a reduced awareness of something, as opposed to a positive goal, meaning have more of, or the presence of something that you don't currently have. Negative goals we all develop all the time. That's why people are all very clear. Every time you have a painful experience, you don't want that again. So you know what you don't want. Only in terms of what you've experienced that you didn't like. You don't want it again. I don't want to be sad anymore. I don't want to be stressed anymore. I don't want to fail anybody. I don't want to disappoint anybody. I don't want to waste my life. I don't want to, et cetera, right? But the positive goals are not things that we learn naturally. We have to be taught, and people aren't very often taught that. But yeah, until you figure that out, you can't make a plan. You can't execute. So people struggle to do their homework, right? And everyone's like, oh, it's executive dysfunction. And it is, because executive function, execute, whatever. But the goal then isn't, this is like our whole thing here, right? The goal then isn't to be like, let's give you the skills you need or motivate you by making it more important or valuable to you to execute on those things. Sometimes that's necessary, but it's only necessary when something external makes it necessary. Mm-hmm. As opposed to saying, okay, well, maybe part of the reason that you're struggling to execute is because the plan that you're trying to follow is not a good fit. And then maybe the reason that the plan is not a good fit is because you're not even going for what you want to go for, or you don't understand how what you're being asked to do connects to what you eventually want. One way to think of, I was reading somebody's tweets earlier about, ADHD people are not motivated by rewards. They're motivated by the enjoyment of the experience, which, any kind of absolute statement like that obviously leaves a lot of gaps, because that's not universally true. And also, what do you mean? And blah, 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 and motivation and yada, yada. But effectively, one way that I think is useful for clients with ADHD to think about this is to imagine. So we mentioned earlier that only the present moment is real. Memories of the past are not real. Doesn't mean they're inaccurate. Just they're not real. They're in your head. And predictions about the future are not real. Only the moment is real. The further you get from the present moment, in time, the further back you go and the further into the future you project, the less connected to reality that becomes. Does that make sense so far?
Okay.
That like the longer ago a memory is from, the less likely it is that it is accurate. The further into the future you project, the less likely it is that it is accurate.
Garnet and Steven Universe talks about that. But
totally. I don't know Garnet and Steven Universe, but they sound cool. One way to think about ADHD that can be useful for some people is to think of that as a steeper curve. You know, that in like practical terms, I often will tell people like, look, only the last 2 weeks and the next 2 weeks exists to me. My memory, my brain, my working memory works in such a way that if it was more than 2 weeks ago, that it didn't happen. I might be aware of it, but I'm aware of it like the way I'm aware of a movie, you know, like not real. And if it's more than 2 weeks away, it's not happening. So I need something in those 2 weeks to look forward to, right? So everybody would rather be doing an enjoyable thing than an unenjoyable thing. But we all of us all the time do things that aren't enjoyable or are less enjoyable than another option we could be doing because we believe it's connected to something else in the future that we want, right? So that's why I don't like the term motivated and all. It leaves all this gray area here where in terms of, you know, one model that I think is helpful, people talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic meaning that the experience of the thing is in and of itself something that motivates you. Extrinsic meaning that the experience of it doesn't motivate you, but it is connected to something that you want, and that's what motivates you. And again, don't like motivated. But we have talked, when we talked about energy, in terms of energy return, and there's two ways to get energy back. One is because I'm engaging in something that I'm enjoying and it energizes me moment to moment. The other is I'm completing a thing and that energizes me, which kind of maps over to that same intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. So one way I think is helpful is not to say a binary like I am not motivated, but none of us are motivated by rewards if we have ADHD, because of course everybody is different no matter what we have in common. That's the whole point. That even if we all have ADHD, we're still different. So we can't make an absolute statement like that. And I know people are trying to compress things into a tweet and they don't, you know, like they know there's more nuance than that too. I'm not trying to take away from anybody. But I find it helpful to think of, we talk in terms of sequencing, that even if I can intellectually make a plan and know that step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leads to step 100, and I really want step 100, that in the moment, because we were always talking about efficiency, not capacity, that in the moment when I'm doing step 1, even though I made a plan and I'm intellectually aware it connects to 100, I can't hold step 100 and the connection it has to step 1 in my head presently. So even though I know theoretically it connects, when I'm going to do it, I'm not aware of that in the moment. And I'm just doing 1. And if 1 sucks, it's really hard to do, even though I know it's connected to 100. And there's variables there. And one way to think about it is that ADHD people, generally speaking, are less efficient at sequencing. We have a harder time. It's not about whether we can make plans, but we have a harder time holding those plans in our awareness as we engage in the steps. So practically speaking, that equates to make smaller plans, you know, reward yourself more frequently, break tasks into smaller pieces, etc. And really, this is all we're doing with everything. This is what language is about, what communication is about, is there's a thing that you don't find enjoyable or less enjoyable than another thing you could do. But by me saying words or, you know, communicating with you through whatever language, I have now changed it, hopefully, so that the other thing is now the thing you're going to do.
Interesting. I always think it's funny, random thought, but we talk about the 3 things, you know, what you want, planning and executing. I always used to think like, oh, we teach kids to execute first. I always imagine a little baby, like headman, like the cute little like baby with his little like mask on, or their little mask on and little axe. And
a very appropriate observation for our talk about communication. That
So,
you think of a different type of execute when I say execute it.
but also that's adorable. A little baby executioner,
Sure.
just like
Totally.
adorable thing. Yeah.
No, I mean, like executive functioning, a lot of people think of executives in a business, in a corporate sense. Oh, it's the boss stuff, you know, the stuff that's in charge, or the stuff that directs the resources, doesn't do the work itself, but organizes and directs resources and whatever.
Or as we see it, steals the resources and labor of those around them. But
really it's about executing. Intellect has ideas. Executive functioning takes those ideas, looks at the environment, the external, and then manages your resources so that you can put those ideas out into reality as opposed to just into your head. And yes, even communication involves executive functioning. Language processing, like we were just talking about, it's executive functioning, being able to choose the right words, interpret things accurately, or be aware when I'm not, and how to rectify it. That's all executive functioning stuff. Metacognition, we don't have time for all that. Let's do one like really practical, quick question. Give me something. Somebody give me like a misunderstanding you've actually had, a miscommunication you've actually had, or one that is ongoing, or even if it's hypothetical, it's not really you, just something specific.
Wow, that's a lot of things. Not in the spot. I can't think of a single thing, and I have these other things prepared, and then there's this.
Yeah, I'm sure I can think of something.
Yeah, wait till this is over, and then we'll have
Actually, go back and rewatch the cleaning and organizing one, and a lot of what we're talking about there is this: that clean, the word clean, is one of those words, right? That to me, cleaning the kitchen means this. To you, cleaning the kitchen means that, and there's a difference. So you tell me you cleaned the kitchen, but it's not clean. But it's because of what we mean, and that's where we want to get specific and observable again. Analytical allows us to have more complex, abstract ideas conveyed with less resources. It's quicker, it's easier. Observational precision takes more time, more energy, but has the upside of making it less likely that we are misunderstanding one another. The difference between clean the kitchen versus make sure all the dishes are in the dishwasher and wipe down the counters like this and whatever,
So this is a good question because I struggle with this a lot. I'm just like unaware of everything all the time. So how do I communicate? Like cleaning is a great example. Like how do I communicate like what I'm like wanting or trying to say without coming across either condescending or nagging of like, oh, you didn't do it this way, you didn't do it that way. It's like I'm not intending to say like that. It's like, oh, my expectations are this, and like the reality of like my expectation was failing there. Like, yeah,
we're gonna go real fast, so we're gonna not get into what condescending means and what nagging means and how you're perceiving that that's how they feel about you, as opposed to you're worried that there's a 0.1% chance, but it's very important to you, etc.
No, the feedback is those two things.
Here's the general rule. I'll give you two general rules. Number one, the more that your experience is shared by another person, the more you can rely on that in order to communicate. And the opposite is true. The more that is different from your experience and mine, the less we can rely on that things that I say are going to mean the same thing to you. And I mean, you were talking about your parents earlier. Generational, context that changes over time is one of those things, that experiences are different. And so things that I assume, I had a teenage client the other day tell me that he got a parking ticket for parking in front of a fire hydrant, and he was shocked by it. And like, right? I had the same response. I was like, yeah, he just graduated driver's ed, and he's like, they did not tell us in driver's ed. And I was like, okay, didn't fully, because in my driver's ed, it was clear. And I'm very clear that you don't park in front of a fire hydrant. He's like, I asked like 30 people, and like 10 of them knew about this rule. And, to what extent he's exaggerating, whatever. I was like, this is a cultural difference of which I was not aware. And my response showed that when he said that, I did have a moment of like, no one's told you this? I believe you weren't aware of it or didn't process it, didn't remember it, but no one told you. But then when he says 15 other people didn't, I'm like, okay, now I'm more questioning myself. Why did I jump to everybody knows? But now I'm also really fascinated to know, why did the culture change in that specific way? Like, that's a very pop culture thing to me. Like, you don't have to be taught that. You just know, don't park in front. Like, I have very specific images of cars with the windows busted out and fire hoses through them, Anyway, so that's
also because we're slowly becoming boomers. So that's why we're becoming very detached from.
Well, I mean, that is the thing, right? That as the context changes, the language changes, that different things are connected to even if we both know the word fire means fire, the context of that to me and to you is different, right? So that's one. So the more you have in common with another person in terms of your lived experiences, the more you can kind of relax and be less vigilant about, are we on the same page? The more discrepancy there is, the more it's worth putting in your time and energy and effort to make sure that I got to be aware that what I think means this might not to that person. So that's one general rule. What was the other one? What was your question again?
How to like not be naggy,
condescending and stuff. Oh, so here's the other general rule. Go back to our prefrontal cortex shutdown. I know we presented that mostly as a binary, but it's not a binary. Your prefrontal cortex never is completely shut down, but it,
things aren't binary.
Resources are taken to other things and blah blah blah. So the other general rule is don't talk about it when it's happening. Talk about it beforehand, or talk about it well afterwards when a lot of other things have happened in the middle. Because again, that's the point of language, is to be able to be on the same page about something that is not currently happening. If I wanted this and you're doing this and we try and talk about it right now, we're in a different place. We're not in a place to be doing that kind of communicating. Later, after we've had a bunch of fun together or fun separately and we're calm, then we can say, hey, let's go back and talk about this thing. And same with beforehand. But, of course, we can't always anticipate what's going to be a miscommunication. So we don't always know. And then, the other thing is more precise. That a lot of times what we're saying condescension is like, if I say to you, Cecil, this is not what cleaning the kitchen means. That might sound condescending. If I say, this is not what cleaning the kitchen means to me, that's going to probably sound less condescending. And if I get more and more and more into the precision, then it'll be less and less and less. In other words, the more words I use, the more of my time and energy I take to communicate something, the less blanks there are for you to fill in with your analysis. Okay. So if I'm worried about how you're interpreting, of course, there's always, you said earlier, well, maybe I'm talking way too much, and that's why that can be a very hard thing for people to rectify. It's like, I don't know how to figure out if I'm talking too much without talking to you about whether or not I'm talking to you too much. So I'm kind of stuck here. And that happens, especially again with neurodivergent people who have a tendency to rely more on the abstract, the intellectual, as opposed to the experiential. And I would say that's when it's a good sign to you of, let's do a thing, because we get information from two different ways: talking, communication, whether that's through a book or through a story or whatever, or through our senses, intellect, executive functioning. So if talking it is not helping, then let's try doing something and see if that experience gives us new information that helps.
Awesome, cool. So that is, sorry to cut you off there. That's it's time. Thank you everybody for joining us for another one of these. We're Effective Artistry. You can find us, our website, effectiveartistry.com. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at EF_artistry. Feel free to check our website, send us a message to that. We have upcoming events, such as the Zoom webinar this evening. It's free to attend. Anyone can attend it. He's got to register for it just because it's a Zoom webinar. We'll be talking about this a little bit more in depth. Also, check out our coming up groups, such as we have a narrative therapy group work that we're going to be utilizing Dungeons and Dragons game for. It's really exciting and awesome, and some other cool events. So yeah, if you have any questions, send us an email or contact us through our other means. But until then, I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you here next Wednesday.
Thank you all for being here.
Awesome. Thanks. Bye.